Hi guys! So I'm wearing the same clothes and general get-up as my last video because I've literally just turned the camera on and off again, and I'm going to make another video before I stop for the night. But I'll probably wait a week to upload this one because I'm actually taking a week and a half holidays, and I've decided to make that holiday not only from my day job but also just pretty much from all the things that I routinely do in my life. I'm going to take a little bit of a break, so I'm kind of pre-writing blogs and pre-recording a video or two that I can put up while I'm on my holiday. So speaking of holidays, I realised when I was writing up a quick blog post about my last video, about 2 videos ago, about the divine and deities, I realised that I had never talked about my sort of famous trip to Kerry. It's something that I reference quite a lot in the blog, but I actually never sat down to write an entire blog post about it. I just kind of never got round to it. And I thought that maybe I would make a video instead. So for anyone who's only been watching my videos, you're not going to have any idea what I'm talking about because I haven't mentioned Kerry at all yet in my videos. But I was actually born in Kerry. I live in Dublin and I grew up in Dublin. I never actually lived in Kerry at all. What happened was I was supposed to be born in the beginning of December or mid-December, something like that. And I was 6 weeks premature. And my parents, they have a house, a small little country cottage. Well, it's a 2-storey, but it's about 4 rooms altogether, so it's a very, very small little country house. They have this little house out in very, very rural Kerry. It really is out in the middle of nowhere. Because my father is actually a geologist, and he did a lot of field work out in Kerry. He based his PhD actually on the rocks of Kerry, I suppose. I don't know an awful lot about his research because I have to say I'm not particularly interested in geography, but that's another story. So I was born 6 weeks premature on Halloween, and my parents were on their midterm break for Halloween in their house in Kerry. So I was born in Tralee, which is I wouldn't call it a city, the biggest town in Kerry. Kerry, for anyone who doesn't know, is it's sort of on the peninsula that is, it's north of Cork, if that means anything, and it's on the furthest kind of southwest peninsula of Ireland. And it's largely a very rural county. There aren't an awful lot of very big towns, particularly in West Kerry. In East Kerry, that's pretty much where all the larger towns are. But I was born in a town in East Kerry because there weren't any hospitals in West Kerry where the house is. But West Kerry is the place that is familiar to me because not only was I born there, but all throughout my childhood we actually spent quite a lot of time there. We used to go down every Easter break, and during the summer at some point we would go down. We didn't actually stay in the house after I was about 2 or 3 because the house was a bit of a disaster. It never had any running water, it had an outdoor toilet, and it just really wasn't a place to be bringing a small child. So we used to stay in a guest house instead. But basically, rural Kerry was it was a really huge, monumental part of my upbringing, even though I didn't see it that way at the time, and I only would have spent 3 to 4 weeks in total in any 1 year there. But I suppose these things, they just really sort of seep into your soul when you're exposed to them a lot as a child. But as it happened, we went up and down a lot until I was about 12 or 13, and then, you know, my teenage years kicked in. I became very interested in music. I was playing a lot of music and going to a lot of festivals during the summer. And we ended up just not really having the time to go down to Kerry, and I wasn't really interested either, to be honest. So I realised this year at some point that it had been over 10 years since I'd actually been in Kerry at all. And I just had this urge to go. I just couldn't. It was just at my very core. You know, when you just get that deep urge, you have to do it. I think it was probably a result of getting into my spirituality and I was starting for the first time in a long time to really start to get in tune again with the rhythms of nature, with the cycles of the year, and the past calendar year, while I've actually been fully practicing, and I would say the last 2 years, but particularly in the last year, I've really just noticed what's going around me so much more in terms of the changing light and plants, and which plants are blooming when, the flowers that are blooming when, the trees are when the leaves are coming on the trees and when they're dying away again, and all of the weather and the temperature and all of this kind of thing. I never realised how little I paid attention to it until it started to become something that I really noticed day to day. And it's not even a conscious choice. I don't consciously sort of, okay, I have to do this as part of my spirituality. It's just become very important to me. So I suppose that's probably what triggered this need to go down to Kerry. I kind of felt like I needed to re-explore my roots, I suppose you could say. I feel like maybe this pagan part of me was actually born in that time that I spent in Kerry. It's such a wild place. I think it just offers up things that a city like Dublin, even though I grew up in quite a I wouldn't say rural, it's very definitely a suburb, but there is a lot of wildlife around. There's sort of a nature area, a couple of hills very near my house where that haven't been built up at all. They're kind of like a nature trail, I suppose you would say, although we wouldn't call it that here. We just call it the hill. Nothing fancy. But there's definitely something that a rural part of the country, and it's a coastal area with a lot of mountains in the background, and then an awful lot of sea, because it's a peninsula, the particular area that we go to. It's one little peninsula. And it just offers something totally different to anything you can find in a city. So we went. I had actually recently had some dental work done, which is an ongoing saga that's been going on for over a year now. I had the tooth pulled a year ago, and it's still an ongoing thing, but I'd had some dental work before we went, so it was all of it kind of a bit stressful and whatever. But I was taking a week off work, and my boyfriend was actually, as it happened, he was going somewhere with a couple of his friends as a sort of it wasn't a kind of holiday that I would have been going along with them, just for a few days, so it actually turned out very, very well that we could both go on our separate holidays, because I very definitely wanted to do this with my parents. I mean, first of all, neither me nor my boyfriend have a car, and you really need a car to go anywhere rural in Ireland. Like, there's no way of getting around if you don't have a car. And also, it was something that I needed to do with my parents, revisit all those old childhood places that we used to go. It wouldn't have been right to do it the first time with anybody else. So we went down and we stayed very close to the place that we used to stay. And my God, I hadn't even remembered it correctly. It was breathtakingly beautiful and wild beyond anything that I could have remembered. I hadn't been in a place like that or seen scenery like that in person in I don't know how long. We'd certainly driven around parts of Europe when I was a teenager, but there's something about the homeland, a part of a rural countryside area that you grew up in, that is just particularly special. And I have to say that this part of Ireland, I would say, it's definitely the most beautiful landscape that we have in Ireland. I would say there are probably parts of Donegal that might somewhat live up to it, but that part of West Kerry, far West Kerry, is it's really spectacular. There's just this feeling of space that I had completely forgotten. I'd completely forgotten what it felt like. It's not really a valley. It's sort of just that there are very high mountains, some of the highest mountains in Ireland, which isn't saying an awful lot, but they're sort of high mountains, a couple of ridges of mountains that sort of completely enclose the peninsula. And then once you pass those mountains, you come into this space, and there are a couple of different places that you can kind of stop on the slopes of these mountains as they descend, and you just get this view of just all these fields just spreading out to the sea. And there are a couple of points at which you can kind of stand or walk or sit or whatever, where you can see maybe 3 different bays, a couple of different points of land reaching out, maybe with a couple of hills, and just, almost, 180 degrees anyway of water. It's something to do with that combination of the mountains, and then there are cliffs, and there are beaches, and just all this space. It's just this incredible feeling of space. And obviously when you're in the city, you never really see the sky, not properly. You're constantly kind of enclosed by buildings on either side, even in a city like Dublin, where we don't have any tall buildings really at all. They've been pretty much outlawed. In an attempt to sort of maintain the character of the old city. But it was just something, it was almost as though I was experiencing it for the first time as well, because like I say, I didn't remember it really at all. And I'm saying all this because it really was an extremely religious experience, beyond anything I could have imagined or expected. We had various sort of pilgrimages, secular pilgrimages you could say, that we wanted to do, that I wanted to do, which largely consisted of, there's an old, a very old, not even a monastery, it's just a tiny little, it's not even a church. It was near a monastery, I believe. There was certainly an old church not too far away from it, and there was this tiny little cell built of stones. It's called Golarus, but I don't know, that's the Irish term for it. I don't really know what it's called in English. Oh, that's something I should also say, is that this part of Kerry is the Gaeltacht, which means that it's an Irish speaking area in Ireland. It's one of the few remaining places where people are actually speak Irish natively from birth. That is the language that they indigenously speak to one another, which is rare now in Ireland. And that was quite interesting as well, to be back in a Gaeltacht. I hadn't been in a Gaeltacht since I was quite young, and to go into cafes, and even the young people, people of my own age or whatever, just will naturally speak in Irish to you. It's quite refreshing. You kind of feel like you're going to a slightly different country. And in many ways it kind of is, to Dublin anyway. A lot of parts of rural Ireland are really quite different. The culture is quite different. Because obviously Dublin has had an awful lot more influence from outside, from other cultures, from other countries, whereas rural Ireland has remained a little bit more static, you could say. I think I just felt my pantheism in a whole new way. I started to really become a lot more interested in the concept of goddess at that point. I'd sort of been shying away a little bit from personified deity up until that point. Not completely, but I was kind of trying to just hold back a little bit from it, I think. I felt a little bit as though, particularly my use of Gaia or female archetypes as metaphors for the universe or for cosmos, I felt as though that was maybe a little bit unbalanced, or there's no particular reason for gendering cosmos. I don't see gender, to me, it's not particularly important. I've never divided deities by gender, by male and female. I will categorise them in all sorts of other ways, but I don't find their gender to be particularly important. But I really started to really get on board with the idea of the divine feminine in a really strong way. I mean, it had been an important part of my spirituality, definitely, from the outset, from maybe a year before. In fact, it was probably almost exactly a year to when I went to Kerry, from when I first read Pagayan Cosmology, which I'll link below. And it was definitely Kerry that brought me back to the Morrigan. I've mentioned that in the video about the divine and deities. There was just something about the wildness of the land, and it's funny because it's not even particularly wild. It's extremely farmed land. I mean, every square inch of it really has been farmed, has had the life farmed out of it. Even very high up into the mountains where you know, you couldn't build houses or anything like that. It'd be too high, too windy. They would still, you know, put the sheep up to graze on the grass, even high up in the mountains. So it's not even in its wild or original state, but it is a wildness that it's sort of well beyond anything that we can experience in the suburbs or in the city. I just, more even than the sort of benevolent, loving figure of the sort of light aspect of the goddess or the Great Mother, I could really feel the undertow of the Dark Mother. Something about the sea and the cliffs, the sort of the gradual erosion of the land by the sea and that kind of thing, and also quite a lot of mythology in rural Ireland, the folklore, which is another thing that I definitely grew up with, because my father knows, he's quite interested in Irish folklore, and he would have heard a lot of the local folklore, the local stories from the people that he met, the people that he knew. My father doesn't do anything by halves, so when he was spending quite a lot of time down, and he used to spend maybe even 6 months of the year down in Kerry, he became, you know, nearly almost more native than the natives themselves. So I definitely grew up with these stories, and you know, if he didn't know a story about a particular field or cliff top or part of the land, he would make one up in the vein of the stories that are there. And a lot of them are actually quite sinister. It's funny, the sort of sanitized image of the fairy that has become quite prevalent now in modern contemporary culture. I believe that those kind of fairies, they do kind of stem from other European mythologies. There are fairies in other European mythologies that are quite angelic or light and fluffy, but the fairies in Ireland are very definitely not. They're really quite sinister figures that lure people underground, that lure people into their own world, and you know, they might not allow them to leave again. People in Kerry won't move certain stones or cut down certain trees because they're fairy trees or fairy stones, and they still take this quite seriously, particularly the older people, the older generation. They still take this very, very seriously, because to cut down a fairy tree or to move a fairy stone can bring not only death on yourself but a curse on your family, and it's all quite dark. But I find that very interesting, particularly the idea of the fairies luring people in. I imagine them sort of luring them in under the mountains. There's that feeling of all that expanse of land and the fields running down to the sea, but it's in the background there are these, you know, tall, fairly ominous and steep mountains behind. You have this feeling of this sort of cultivated land kind of trapped between these two primordial, slightly dark and sinister forces, the very sort of tall, sinister mountains, and then the wild sea. And an awful lot of people, there's a large island on which there was quite a large community of people living, and an awful lot of people would have drowned while fishing or travelling back and forth from the mainland to the island, and vice versa. So I feel like perhaps we don't really come in contact with the dark goddess much in our day-to-day lives in suburban life. It's always been a concept that I've really got in touch with and felt very strongly, but I think this was the first time that I really kind of came face to face with her, you could say. I'm not really sure if there's anything else that I could talk about that would be really interesting or relevant to anyone who, you know, outside of my family, I suppose, who doesn't know the area or who didn't have my particular childhood. There were all those various landmarks and cafes and places that we wanted to go to, and a lot of it had changed, which is interesting as well. I mean, nearly everything had changed. The one cafe that we always went to, and it's a wonderful place. The woman, she paints, and she has a little cafe where she sells her paintings and you know, sells scones and pancakes, and it was all just a really very idyllic spot as well. An amazing, incredible view out the window at the side of her house, and she would paint a lot of her paintings just sitting in her own garden. But her place had changed completely. She'd, you know, built a separate building for the cafe, and she seems to be painting an awful lot less. She's getting quite a lot older now. She must be in her 70s, late 70s even. And another cafe that we used to go to, which was in the nearby town, is it's kind of on its last legs, really. It doesn't seem to be getting much custom at all anymore, and to be honest, we didn't even really go in. So it was interesting to see just how much it had all changed over the course of 10 years, and also how much I had forgotten, how much it just I hadn't realised how hazy the memories are. I have generally an incredibly good memory, so it really shocked me that although I could quite accurately remember a specific view or a specific field or a specific church or a specific landmark, it was the overall feeling of it was what I just had completely forgotten. The incredible openness of it. Maybe it was just something that I didn't register because I'd grown up with it. I was used to it, and maybe it just didn't trigger the same emotions in me. I definitely remember that it did sometimes though. I mean, I definitely remember feeling very in touch with nature down there, and like I say, I do believe that it was that experience, those experiences, that led me towards paganism, and that maybe I wouldn't have gone that way if it wasn't for the time I spent there. I'm definitely hoping that in the years to come I'll be spending a lot more time down there. It's the kind of place that if you lived down there you would just have to be creative. I feel like I would have to paint. I would absolutely have to paint. It would just pour out of me if I was living down there. And it's interesting because up here in Dublin I don't paint at all these days. I really don't. I keep almost feeling it. I keep having the pull, but I'm such a perfectionist that it's very easy for me to end up not doing that kind of thing. So it's a very powerful place for me, and yeah, I'm hoping that I get the chance in years to come to spend an awful lot more time down there. So I just wanted to share my experience with you. I hope it was interesting, and I'll talk to you guys soon.